But the privilege that many Southern blacks most desired was the right to vote, still often denied them. In Selma, Alabama, 97% of 15,000 eligible black voters were unregistered. Some because of cynicism or apathy, but most because they faced violence and intimidation from local authorities.
People could only attempt to register on the first and third Mondays of each month.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you went for him. You came down to make a mockery out of his courthouse.
And you had to get some white person to vouch that you were a good character. No white person in his right mind in the state of Alabama was going to vouch that a black person was a good character.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us? We've come to register.
Selma rapidly became the new flashpoint of the civil rights movement. On March the 7th, 1965, 600 civil rights activists planned a march that was to take them from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, some 54 miles away. Their route would take the non-violent demonstrators through what amounted to enemy territory, roads and highways controlled by the Alabama State Police.
They came toward us, beating up with nightsticks, with bullwhips, and trampling us with horses. I was hit in the head and just left lying there. And I felt like it was the last protest.
The violence and brutality which ended this march quickly provoked plans for a much larger one, now joined by Dr. Martin Luther King.
We've gone too far now to turn back.
Dr. King was determined to focus national attention on Selma, and he enlisted the help of supporters from New York to Hollywood.
The Reverend said, the white man can't cool it because he's never dug it.
Marlon Brando was the one who got me involved in civil rights, honestly. I was walking down the street and he just pulled up in the car and he said, how'd you like to go down to Selma? Yeah? I said, Selma, we're going to have a march from Selma to Montgomery. You want to come? And I said, sure.
Before the second march had even begun, the Reverend James Reeb, a civil rights sympathizer, was beaten to death by a white mob. But rather than intimidating the marchers, that violence seemed to give them a powerful ally.
That night, I was with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma when we heard Lyndon Johnson. We watched him make one of the greatest speeches any American president ever made on the whole question of civil rights.
Their cause must be our cause too. It's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Just think of a president with a Southern accent from Texas saying to the Congress of the United States, we shall overcome. Finally, popular protest and public power had come together.
And Dr. King literally started crying. Tears came down his face. I knew then that we would make it from Selma to Montgomery.
On March 21st, 1965, 3,200 people set out from Selma. Four days later, as the march approached Montgomery, there were 25,000 people marching.
It was an amazing moment. It was scary. There were helicopters everywhere, like some sort of angry bugs. And there were only Confederate flags flying. We were the only ones with American flags. Yeah, and Martin Luther King gave a great speech.
All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
There's very few times in your life that you know that you're at some place that you're at a moment where this is one of those things that, as long as there's time, is going to be this moment. And that was it.
United States of America.
On August the 6th, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, finally guaranteeing black Americans the right to vote.
Christine.
But just as it reached a high point, the civil rights movement seemed to split into warring factions.
A revolution of rising expectations stirs people to believe that the promised land is there. It was when change was coming, when there was a sense of possibility, that everything broke loose and went wild.
You're better than the white man. You are better than the white man. And that's not saying anything.
Despite the gains of recent years, it seemed to many blacks that the pace of change was too slow, that Martin Luther King was too accommodating. These blacks began to adopt the separatist rhetoric of the charismatic Malcolm X.
I used to hear Malcolm say, if a man slaps me in the face, I'm not turning my cheek. If I slap him back, he won't slap me again. That made a lot of sense.
Malcolm at that time said clearly, all right, what we need is power. While King would say what we need is morality to help bring out, Malcolm said, forget about them, just get guns, and that's how they're going to regulate the problem. The contradiction, however, was that Martin Luther King was involved in action, confronting the enemy. Malcolm X was not. So what you had to do was take the confrontation of King and match it as best you can with the philosophy of Malcolm X, which is precisely what we did.
We want black power. We want black power.
The response was overwhelming.
What do you want, black power? What do you want? What do you want?
In 1966, militants in Oakland, California founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense and told America that the fight for civil rights would never be the same.
If you come down here jumping on us and beating us up like you were beating up the peaceful protesters with your dogs, your cattle prods, and are shooting them and are murdering these peaceful protesters, we're not going to take it. When you start shooting, we're shooting back.
The call by militant leaders for total revolution received a sympathetic ear in many of the nation's impoverished inner cities, where the Great Society was still nowhere to be seen.